All right, let's go ahead and get started. So, um, since we've already covered, our cyber luminaries, we've covered the question about vulnerability management, we've talked about the backbone, we've talked about AI. So now is the time for us. We've talked about critical infrastructure. So now we got to talk about actually going on the offense and how we actually take the fight to the bad guys. And so I think we've got a really excellent panel to talk about the how do we punch them in the face and actually have the effects that we want. And so I'm really excited to welcome Stacey O'Mara up here to moderate this panel. Take it away.
I feel like that was almost a Freudian slip to mediate this panel since we're talking about punching everybody in the face. All right, well, I kind of feel like I'm already letting you down because I've been trying to think of a good movie reference to equate to this topic since we've been talking about Die Hard and Armageddon all day. And actually, my peers here at Venable might appreciate it because we were talking about it recently, but maybe Sneakers, Robert Redford, rest in peace. Like maybe if, later bring me some of those references. But thank you for sticking around and being with us all day. I'm super excited about this session. We've been working on a special project related to offensive cyber operations. And oh, wait, maybe we can do Ghostbusters because this is about myth busting. So throw those in to keep this going today. So there is a QR code. When prompted, please use your phones unless some of you are already voting. I assure you, we are not sending you to a malicious site. But thank you again. Welcome to our final session for CyberNext, Myth Busting, the Real Path to More Effective Offensive Cyber Operations. I would say right now, there are a few areas of cybersecurity that attract as much debate or as many misconceptions as offensive cyber operations. Popular culture often portrays cyber offense as quick and easy, while policy discussions, as we can all attest, can oversimplify the real technical, legal, and strategic complexities. This panel today is going to cut through some of those myths and ground the conversation in the realities of strategy, operations, and governance. And I'm really honored to have each of our panelists introduce themselves. They are luminaries as well. Probably don't need an introduction, but can I just start with Meredith? We'll go down the line and do a quick introduction, and then we'll jump into the session.
Hi, I've been told to be brief. Meredith Burkhart. I spent the last 15 years at the FBI. Most recently, I was the chief of cyber policy for the FBI. And now I am 5 weeks into the private sector, working for Halcyon, creating a new ransomware research center for them. I'm also still digesting that when you're putting together a panel for punching them in the face, that it's Leonard, Meredith, and Mika that come to mind.
Hi, everyone. I'm Mika Ouyang. I'm the former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Cyber Policy in the previous administration, which means that I spent 4 years overseeing the Department of Defense's offensive cyber operations.
And hello, my name is Leonard Bailey. I, until January of this year, was Special Counsel for National Security and head of the Cybersecurity Unit at the Department of Justice. I spent the last few years there working on the issue of deconflicting various cyber operations from different agencies with our criminal investigations.
All right, thank you. So, I mean, we thought of you because you guys are like the ultimate fighting champions, right? Okay, so obviously, decades of experience between the three of them in cyber operations, law enforcement, defense, and policymaking. And we're kind of going to go through this and examine 4 different areas. And while I briefly go over those, please go ahead into the poll and answer the question. Don't forget, select as many as you think apply. And what we're going to do is have a discussion. And then we're going to re-poll the audience and we're going to do a little comparing and contrasting and see if we influenced any of your thoughts around this topic. But we are going to examine which myths about offensive cyber are the most damaging and why they persist. What are some of the real world constraints faced by operators and policymakers? How do we navigate escalation, attribution, and collateral effects in offensive missions? And finally, how do we define success in this space? How do we balance tactical wins with long-term strategic impact? So I'm sorry, I'm navigating the tech here. Okay, so right now, wow, this is like a landslide. 91% have said that military and intelligence agencies should be authorized to conduct offensive cyber operations, followed 64% by law enforcement agencies 50% said a government certified private company, 32% said a government certified individual, and finally 5%, this is interesting. I want to know who the 5% is here. All right, an individual or private company regardless of certification. Okay. All right, I'm going to start at the beginning. So let's think about the foundations, right? And I know that we've seen a lot of reporting and some papers out here on a taxonomy and a common lexicon around offensive cyber operations. So that's where we're going to start. Meredith, a lot of the discussion has, as I said, focused around this need for a common taxonomy on what cyber or offensive cyber operations are. Some define it by 3 key factors: acting on someone else's system without permission and intending to cause damage or harm. Okay. And then also disruption at the time of action. So, and these are just samples. How well does this definition actually hold up in practice? And what other terms or definitions should we consider in this space? And then finally, where do they intersect with pre-existing taxonomies and frameworks already at work in digital operations against more traditional adversaries like criminals, terrorists, and espionage actors?
Sure. So this definition, like so many others that are out there on offensive cyber operations, I think matches potentially one person's view of what we mean by computer network operations, offensive cyber operations, et cetera. As a wise person once told me, because I love policy, it's what I live and breathe, is that you solve 90% of your policy problems in the definition section. I truly believe that. And so when I'm looking at a policy or looking at an issue that we might solve at least partially through policy, I look at what are the terms, what's the taxonomy that we currently have, does everyone believe in those definitions, has there been consensus building around them? And what I'd say in this particular space, the answer is we don't have consensus, nor do we have all of the terms in the public domain, because so many of them are behind classification walls, or might just be in different niche parts of industry. So I also have the unfortunate, I have the memory of a goldfish. So I wrote down some terms, just a sampling that we have in this domain. So at the top that we have computer network operations. Everyone knows the acronyms, hopefully, of CNO, CNA, CNE, CND. And those sort of sit at the top. They aren't necessarily legal definitions. And then we're fortunate enough that DoD started defining their own terms and doctrine, refining what they mean by CNA, CNE, CND. We have certain terms that come from them, including countermeasures, cyber operational preparation of the environment, defensive counter cyber. All of these have different terms and doctrine and usage over within the military. We also know active defense, defend forward. What do these mean? These are part of strategy. And those definitions have expanded over time. Meanwhile, in law enforcement and the operations that we're doing at the FBI and DOJ, or I'm 5 weeks out, so I still refer to it as we have certain terms such as search and seizure, and we use Rule 41. It's a very technical legal term applied in the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act context to go out and affect systems, sometimes that the FBI does not own, right? But to have an effect on a machine. We refer to computer network operations. That's a very specific term within the Bureau. It's public what that term is. It's public that there is a computer network operations policy guide with additional terminology, what's inside of it, and the additional terms that are defined there and how they govern what's done inside of the Bureau is not public. Also public is that DOJ has Attorney General guidelines on extraterritorial operations. And there's a lot to unpack there in cyber offensive operations under the extraterritorial operations guidelines. However, what's inside of those guidelines is similarly not public. What I'd argue is that we have so many terms out there, and I could list more. There are many more on this note card and many more that you could Google, including industry terms such as hackback. The insurance industry likes to talk about cyber subrogation as something they might be able to do offensively. Do we include that in a common understanding of what we mean by offensive cyber operations? Does that matter? or is what matters what is legal, what is permissible, and what we want to actually create and have the intention to create as a society. I think that a first good step is in some venue, make sure all the terms are captured. I'm not sure if it's a good idea to release all classified terminology for the public to consume, but I do think there have to be certain trust groups in which members of the cybersecurity community can participate in developing a common lexicon.
Thank you for that. And even just between the three of us and a couple of our other colleagues, we've been geeking out on this topic for the past 10 days. And Leonard, in some of our discussions, you raised concerns that manipulating data or altering settings, even without impairing availability, should still qualify as offensive. Can you walk us through why integrity-based effects belong in the definition, and what risks would we be running if they're actually excluded?
Sure. So I guess I'll approach it from the same sort of viewpoint as Meredith. I think there's a lot of fragmentation in these terms and the terminology in this area, and where possible, I think we should be trying to instead come up with more cohesive terminology that we use here. My views on this are shaped, one, by my views as a lawyer, and second, I think there's a common sense argument for why you want to include things like altering settings as part of what is considered within the scope of this definition. On the legal side, we have a definition for damage. The federal statute for hacking is 18 U.S.C. 1030, and 1030 E8 has a definition of damage as any act that impairs the integrity or availability of a computer, data, program, or system. And in that definition, it really reflects something that already reaches out into other agencies, the sort of triad that we have of confidentiality, integrity, and availability that was kind of largely popularized by NIST ISOs and DoD frameworks in the late 80s and early 90s. So the 1030 statute reflects this. That term integrity has a meaning in law right now. We have at least one case in the Second Circuit, U.S. versus USOL, that makes clear that things like altering settings on a computer, or at least installing software on a computer, alters the integrity of that system. Now you have a system that is something other than the corrupted version of that system that the owner-operator should presume that they had. And therefore, it falls within the definition of damage. And so I think, as on a legal basis, kind of right now, the notion of changing settings does fall within what we consider a violation of the hacking statute, and therefore should be kind of captured in this term. The more common sense reason has to do with things like, in this day and age, when altering a setting on an operational technology system, something that we use hardware, software to interact with automated physical systems, and by altering those settings, you can do things like overloading a pipeline, releasing a dam, disrupting a wastewater system. When you can do those things through your online activity, I think that kind of common sense wise falls within the ambit of what we consider an offensive cyber operation. So I think there are these two reasons that we should make sure that whatever that first part of the definition that's about acting on someone else's system captures these concepts.
Okay, and finally, also in our discussions, and Meredith, to your point, we have this plethora of definitions, but if we were to start organizing them, Mika, you've cautioned that broadening the definitions too far could collapse the distinction between Title 10, which is military, and Title 50, which includes intelligence activities. How important is it to keep those distinct, and what risks do we face if we actually fail to do so?
Yeah, I think one of the challenges that when we talk about definitions, we're assuming a certain context around those definitions. And I think it's really important that we're thinking about for what purpose, like which actors and for what purpose. Because, I was spent the last 4 years in the Department of Defense, and there are a lot of things that are permissible in wartime that the government would be allowed to do, that we might ask for help doing, that are not permissible in peacetime. right? And so that would fall under a state of Title 18 authorities. And then there are things that happen under intelligence collection authorities that would be very different than in either of those things. So the question really is like, when we're talking about offensive cyber, there is this really important definitional question of like, who is the actor, or like in which of these categories is the actor acting? Because for the military to be able to do the kinds of things that it would need to do in wartime, it might need to be prepared to do those things before that war starts. And some of those activities might look to someone like their offensive cyber activities. It is the the preparation that Leonard's talking about for that actual turning off of the critical infrastructure, right? Or whatever that thing is. Those things, right, and how we think about what is permissible and who is doing them are really important to thinking about like what are we trying to accomplish with offensive cyber? And then for an analysis of like, what is the risk and liability that would be affiliated with those things, depending on whose behest you were acting.
So super complicated to try and get to a common set of definitions, which I know we're not going to solve here today, but just these are all great points as we think about that as a community. But Mika, I want to pull on something that you said a little bit and then transition into a conversation on escalation and stability. So, okay, once we define offensive cyber, let's say the next challenge is to actually manage escalation and those stability risks. So, you've expressed deep concern over escalation here, that the private sector, quote unquote, hackback or even certain state operations could spiral into a kinetic conflict. So how should escalation risk shape the boundaries of offensive cyber operations today?
Yeah, this is a really important thing to consider that I think the average private sector actor might not consider if they're considering whether or not to do a cyber operation, is that like falling against a backdrop of geopolitical tension, what we've seen is that some countries are not very good at attribution. So, or make presumptions that all outbound cyber activity from a country is under the control of the government and intended by that government. And so if they think in a period of geopolitical tension that disruption that comes from a private sector actor is actually an intentional act by the US government, the response isn't necessarily going to be limited to the cyber domain, right? If someone in the private sector hacks back a thing where they don't fully understand the risk and say it causes a colonial pipeline in another country, that country mistakes the disruption for their critical infrastructure as the beginning of an armed conflict and fires back a missile. Thanks a lot, guys, for starting a war, right? Like, so there are questions about escalation and what could happen here that I think require really important coordination with the government to be able to understand what's going on and what the context is, because these operations don't carry with them explanatory language. It's like, we just mean this, right? It's just an effect. And so I think that there's significant risk when they're ambiguous that way, that they can get overread and the response could come back in a way that surprises us. And the thing with cyber operations is that they're never the end of the story. It's never like you smack some guy across the face and you're like, ta-da, we're done here, right? Like they go back, they're mad about it, they do something else to you or whoever they think it is, and now you're in a spiral.
Right. Okay. So this is exactly where I want to go. Meredith, Leonard, if you could both weigh in here. What role does reciprocity play? When the U.S. takes offensive actions, do we inadvertently legitimize similar actions by our adversaries? And if so, how do we manage that risk?
You're asking if the U.S. government does it? So if the U.S. government, I'm a big believer in norms. I'm a big believer in all the levers that we've installed in the United States government, including the 14 norms of responsible state behavior in cyberspace that we have signed on to through the UN's group of governmental experts and their cyber group. There are arguments as to whether everyone follows every norm to the letter, and they aren't binding. However, I do think they are a good guide for what we do in cyberspace. There are acceptable uses by nation states under those norms of cyber operations, whether it's computer network exploitation, potentially like spy games and spycraft. Is that permissible to conduct routine spycraft against other nations? It is under those norms. Is using computer network exploitation and operations to steal companies' IP to give to our own companies and to assist them economically? No, that's not acceptable under those norms. There are similar models to follow when it comes to disruption, defacement, etc., things that we might imagine in the offensive domain. And echoing Mika, this is going to change depending on whether we're in a wartime scenario or a peacetime scenario. And I think that we are in good stead so long as we follow those norms to claim a just war or just action under the threshold of hostilities in cyberspace, and that we would hope through avenues like the UN, through the counter ransomware initiative that multiple nations are a part of, and other similar international forums, that we can introduce moral hazard, diplomatic channels, et cetera, by which other nation states, it's communicated to them that there are certain actions that are permissible in the offensive domain and certain ones that are not.
Leonard?
So in August, Dmitry Alperovich stood right at that podium and gave a keynote in which he argued that us doing more offensive operations just couldn't be escalatory, because what are they going to do? Other countries, they're going to, sort of in his words, are they going to, hit hospitals with more ransomware? Are they going to penetrate more water systems? Are they going to steal more of our IP? And my answer, I guess, is yes. I think, I think it would be escalatory to do more. I think it'd be folly for us to think that making this sort of SOP wouldn't result in some increase in the frequency of these types of operations touching US systems. That said, I think that the US government, law enforcement, intelligence, and the military all have to do cyber operations in this world. There's a necessity for it. There's a need to be able to deal with things that are transporter threats, to obtain evidence, to obtain intelligence, to project force. So what does that mean? I think that does mean that we're going to have to struggle and deal with a problem we have, and that is we have existed in the universe of strategic ambiguity. We have been unwilling to take a clear declaratory position on what our view of the use of this type of authority is. And strategic ambiguity is a logical, policy. It avoids direct conflicts. It allows us maximal flexibility. But if the US government is going to now make this kind of a standard operating procedure, I think we're going to have to be nudged into an area where we are clearer about what our position is on the use of this type of authority. And then we're going to have to do the work of trying to figure out how, as a country that has an incredibly large attack surface, that hosts much of the country of the world's important internet infrastructure, how we have a policy that looks like that doesn't result in just unfettered, all-out, I wouldn't say warfare, but
Yeah, and I would just add to that, even in the cyber domain, I think it's really complicated to get into a cycle of tit for tat on offensive cyber operations with an adversary. And because actually we could experience more disruption here than we do. And we're not even in a cycle of, right, like the people that we are in that cycle with are not actually a nation state actor. We've got a bunch of ransomware actors, but there are places where we have seen two cyber capable actors going at each other in the cyber domain in the Middle East. And I think that there are some real challenges that come with that, because what then you might experience is that you experience the disruption from your other guy's cyber disruption of your territory, population, etc. But because of the sensitivity of these operations, you can't say what you did back. And if it's not visible, then all you're doing is, it feels like you are getting hit in the face And even if you are punching back, you may never have that sort of public confidence. It's only a very small group of people who know that you're punching back. And then sort of like, what are you achieving in terms of, have you made it stop? Like, what is the ultimate goal here? Are you trying to make the activity stop? Because now if you're engaging in a cycle of offensive cyber where you're like, okay, gloves are off, all you've done is legitimize the activity. And like, how do you actually get to an end of that activity unless you're willing to escalate through the entire escalation ladder? And let me just tell you, as someone who sat in the conversations about the full escalation ladder, it does not end well.
All right, so I deliberately asked that question about USG. So who wants to talk to us about insert? And you saw that was one of the options, right, for the poll. Companies that are out acting freely on their own, or companies that are perhaps certified by the government. What does reciprocity look like in those cases if they are performing offensive cyber operations? And what are the consequences look like?
So I'll say that when we talk about the industry or private sector being interested in conducting offensive cyber operations, I think that I don't think it's entirely correct. I think there certainly is a portion that which would offer services that would provide offensive capabilities are interested in this. I don't think much of industry outside of that has a strong interest. There are some financial companies I've heard who have some interest, but outside of that, really, I think this is the province of cybersecurity firms, by and large. Now, and one of the reasons why I think other companies just aren't is I just don't think that, Megacorp is interested in making part of their corporate mission taking on the GRU or the FSB, right? That's not something you explain to your shareholders or your board or. So again, cybersecurity firms, they may be equipped to do this. The ones that I've talked to have expressed a greater interest in doing things like providing access, being an access broker for the government, which makes a lot of sense. That is, they see a lot of things, they've ended up in a lot of places, and they can hand that information over to the government for actioning, which I think avoids the escalatory concern, because even the best cybersecurity firm may not be equipped to deal with a nation state level act of reciprocity. So I think, I personally, I tend to think that there is a way of avoiding the reciprocity issue, and that is by not having private sector actors be the trigger pullers, let's say, but instead work alongside the government to provide the type of access or information needed to conduct these operations, and maybe avoid some of these issues.
And I do think there is a place for private sector actors assisting the government, right? The Department of Defense has a huge number of contractors, right? There are places where if this is a mission that you are interested in, please talk to our friends at the fort and see if they you have a mission or a capability that would be relevant to them that they would want to purchase. But this is not something for the everyday person who is not part of that enterprise or affiliated with that enterprise or working, in concert with, to just go out and do, because I think that there's it's really hard for a private sector actor to have the kind of insight into what they might be disrupting relative to the resources that a government brings to bear to understand the context and the infrastructure of what might happen there. I think that could be really problematic. And the private sector actor, if they're doing this in a way that's just sort of off on their own, like a 1800s privateer, may not be witting to the very labor intensive, resource intensive, complex military or law enforcement activities that might be setting up in preparation to do something and kind of blunder into the middle of that operation if they are not in the process of coordinating. And the government is actually in a much better position to be able to do something much more lasting and impactful to the actor through indictments, arrests, or other things that I think would be much more valuable. I think, right, from the military perspective, it's unless you're in an armed conflict, it's really hard to do something about the human actor, which is why we had such great partnerships with our law enforcement colleagues who, especially in peacetime, can do something about the human actor on the other side, right? Out them, sanctions, arrests, make it difficult to travel, whatever the thing is that like are just not in our toolkit for us. And network disruption is like, ooh, you gave a guy a spinning pinwheel of death for a while. Like, I don't know that that's making the kind of strategic impact against the threat that we are facing, and the disruption that we're facing right now.
And I'll just add one example where we got lucky on the question of reciprocity, and a lone wolf American overzealous, overeager hacker. This was public in a highly colorful Wired article, where there was I want to call him a kid, but I think he was in his 20s, who got frustrated with being hacked a couple times by, you guys probably have heard this story, by DPRK actors. And so I think the way it was dramatized in the Wired article is he sat for months on his couch with Dina tapes and Hot Pockets. And finally the day came, he took the entire intranet of North Korea offline for 3 days. And at the time being in government, I remember, was this you guys? The call around, who's doing this? And what had to happen is we had to have, once we figured out what was happening, the local FBI field office had to go knock on this kid's door, say like, hey, this is not how we do things. In fact, you're in violation of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. It could cause a major it is causing a major diplomatic incident. We're very worried. We're deeply troubled. Luckily, the internet turned itself back on. Not sure if that's by design that you intended that, but don't do it again. And other things followed, right? But we got lucky because there's a moment in there where you wonder, are the North Koreans going to respond? We need to communicate somehow that we are responding. This wasn't us. And the thought occurred, in my mind at least, what if it hadn't been the North Koreans? What if it had been the Russians? Or, I mean, you have a whole question, would the same capability have been, would the kid have been capable of taking all of Russia offline as opposed to the North Koreans, based on how it's structured, the infrastructure structured. But if it had been the Russians, could we have experienced a much different response that we would all have regretted? And I think that was an example where we got lucky. Now, I do think, alluding to some of what has been discussed already, I would hope, I've always hoped that we could build more channels by which that eagerness and that capability that we have here in the United States can be better channeled. So there's a difference between the cybersecurity firms who want to participate or enable, do good works, or either become contractors and they can make money off of it, and do good works at the same time, and participate in offensive cyber operations for the good of national security and American victims, and those who are lone wolves, cybersecurity researchers, white hats, gray hats. I think those are two distinct things, but I also think that there are channels we could create by which those folks have a way to participate, or they at least apply to participate. Now, whether that's through one of their local 55 FBI cyber task forces that do allow for folks to join in certain contexts and potentially be deputized and work with their local cyber squad to develop these operational scenarios, which either come from FBI or DoD. That's a matter in many ways of training and resourcing, because the mechanism exists, but there isn't always the messaging that mechanism does exist, or the people on the other end in government to receive potentially a deluge of folks who want to reach out and join. So I'll end my comments there. Yeah.
Thank you for that. Okay, and that anecdote actually transitions us into the next topic, which is around the legal constraints and legal authorities, which I think are actually kind of the backbone of this debate around offensive cyber operations most of the time. So Leonard, you've noted that beyond the CFAA, reconnaissance and tool use for hackback could implicate surveillance statutes that lack exceptions for private actors. Can you expand on those overlooked legal hurdles and what that means for the hackback debate?
Sure. So when we talk about this area, hackback, or the active defense, or whatever you call it, the conversation almost always vectors to the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, the federal hacking statute, and that makes sense. That's highly relevant. But one thing that I think is often overlooked, and it's been overlooked in the two pieces of legislation that's tried to address hackback in some form, the ACDC Active Cyber Defense Certainty Act from 2019 and the current letters of marque bill that's been offered, is that the only issue isn't the CFAA for conducting reconnaissance, for understanding how you can affect a system. You have to understand the steady state of that system. You have to understand its current status, which may involve collecting content, non-content information on that network, so that you understand what's happening and what you will need to interact with. Well, that may involve electronic surveillance, and if it's done in connection with a domestic system, much of this may occur overseas, and things like the Wiretap Act or the Pen Register Trap and Trace Act don't apply extraterritorially. But in this day of virtual private networks that are located anywhere, or AWS or other things that bad guys spin up that may have a nexus to the US, you may be dealing with domestic electronic surveillance statutes. The government is not able to just wave off a private sector's violation of electronic surveillance laws. There's this general legal notion going back to 1937, this case called Nardone, in which the court said, when you have a criminal statute of general application, it applies to the government, unless Congress says it doesn't. And with statutes like the Wiretap Act, Congress has said, if you're going to conduct electronic surveillance, you do it this way. And that means we have to do it that way. And that means our agents, if we deputize a private actor, would also have to do it that way. And this is something I haven't seen really addressed at all in this discussion, the sort of reconnaissance part, which is, I think, a necessary element of doing these type of operations, and how that would be handled under the law.
Thank you for that. And Meredith, in your past roles at the FBI and ONCD, you've had to navigate similar legal boundaries and other related risks. So what are some principles that policymakers should consider to balance operational ambition with the liability and litigation risks that private actors in particular would face if authorized through CFAA exceptions, deputization, or some other new legal frameworks to conduct these quote unquote hackback operations?
So from the government perspective, I think that one of the first things, if we were to go down the route, and that's a big if, of bringing in industry folks, either through deputization, contracting, issuing letters of marque, that's also a big if, or the menu of options on how industry were to participate in cyber effects operations, reconnaissance on behalf of the government, exceptions to CFAA. If we were to go that route, when assessing how the industry feels about liability, or more than feels, but what their attorneys have to say, I've become a big fan over the years of not presuming to know what that is. And so one thing that my first order of business, if I were sitting back in my role at the Office of the National Cyber Director or back at the FBI, is to gather major general counsel firms for general counsel for these major cybersecurity firms and others who have an interest in doing this, as well as the folks who actually want to conduct the operations inside of these entities, and have a very facilitated conversation about what concerns you about liability risks. And I would imagine that you'd have a menu of things that would come back to you. From my 5 weeks in industry, I see a vast appetite amongst the operators that I now work with in industry, that we should do something, or we should help operationally against the adversary. But as soon as they talk to our legal team, they do realize there's legal risk. And so, of course I don't mean that we're going to incur that. And so it's a conversation. And what I'm finding, as I talk to partners as well, is that those conversations oftentimes happen in-house within companies. They happen in sidebars or events like this one, or dinner or what have you. And I don't know if we've ever had a spin up of bringing them all into one place to specifically talk about that liability in the context of, hi, we're from the government, we're here to help. Can't guarantee you letters of marque, but can you tell us collectively from your operational and then also legal risk perspective, what worries you about potentially participating in this with us, be it through deputization, contracting, letters of marque, or that menu of options?
So kind of pulling on this thread of, what might those lanes look like? Mika, can you comment on the constraints and authorities for the United States government and how it can operate in this space in and outside of the US? There's some distinctions there. And then with and without military or law enforcement assistance.
Yeah, I think the US government does have significant constraints, and there's like both authorities constraints and also like just sort of throughput constraints, right? I don't know if you've noticed, but industry has been like offering ridiculous amounts of money to highly qualified technology people. So like for the government, from the government's perspective, it's actually quite difficult for us to retain highly qualified cyber people when they keep leaving for industry. Um, some of us, would have stayed in government, but for the American people. Uh, but like, and so I think there are some constraints about like whether or not you like, do you have the people to do what you need to do? Like, I think that we don't feel like we actually have enough people doing the things that we need to do. But in terms of other constraints, there are constraints too about like when the action is ripe. Right. And I think that there are things it's like, well, do I act now where I might cause some disruption? Or should I think about a bigger, more impactful thing later? Right. It's like we see this in like organized crime and counterterrorism too. Do I like take down the low level guy, or do I leave him out there and follow him up the chain a little bit to try and figure out where there is a sort of bigger and more impactful impact, sort of place up the chain that'll have a broader impact across an ecosystem of malicious activity. But I think when we're talking about constraints on government, some of the other constraints that we have, frankly, is the classification of the action. Because cyber activities, cyber operations for the government, I had to go through all this in the department, like they're highly classified activities. So our ability to bring industry into that context is also constrained by classified information challenges, right? Does the person have an appropriate clearance? Are they clearable? Are they not doing drugs so that they can actually maintain a clearance? Do they have access to classified systems? Are they coming into the classified systems, or are they building classified systems in their network? Are those connected to the government? Like, how do you share information in a real-time way when it's rolling up to something? Like, how far are you letting them into operational planning? Could they even do that? Or, right, are they sort of at the outskirts of this where the information flows in one way because they are not properly authorized to receive return information? These are challenges that we've seen in cyber and the information sharing context for a really long time, but those constraints are even higher when it comes to the operational activity in cyber. So I think that there are a lot of sort of constraints that we face here that I think people haven't really grappled with when it comes to the idea of like, let's just go get the bad guy. And I totally understand that instinct, given what we're facing, but it also creates like the sort of strategic patience necessary to do something very impactful means that we don't get to give into that impulse immediately.
Thank you for the comment on timing. That's actually something that we haven't heard a lot about in this discussion, and it ties very importantly to this question of what are the objectives, what are the desired outcomes, which I'm going to use to transition into another facet of this conversation around public-private sector collaboration. So Leonard, again, talking about objectives here, what are some of the objectives for having the private sector participate in offensive cyber operations? What do those objectives look like? Is it related to deterrence, more frequent operations, expanding a toolkit? How and importantly, how should success be measured for the private sector?
Okay, so lot to say on this one. So let me start by saying that I've tried to create something of a framework, at least in my head, of what the type of activities that the private sector might be engaged in here, starting from that which has probably the least type of legal risk associated with it to perhaps the greatest. The lowest being things like information sharing. I'd say a second tier would be tool sharing and technical assistance. A third, curiously enough, is government directed operations, government sanctioned operations, and then operations done with government collaboration and cooperation. And at the bookend, you have operations conducted by the private sector without any sort of government input. And one question is, where along the spectrum you reside? Frankly, up through kind of technical assistance, that's a great idea. It's such a great idea. We've been doing it now since 2011 in the core flood takedown. If you look at basically every single technical disruption and operation that we've publicly acknowledged through a press release, you'll see it thanks to the private sector because they're necessary. They provide us with a lot of the technical capabilities we have. They've helped us manage the back end of these operations where we had to sort of curate communications coming into command and control servers. And so one, in terms of myths, I want to make sure that people don't have the impression that the private sector isn't involved. The private sector has been involved, is welcome, and is necessary to conduct these operations. The question really is whether the private sector will be trigger pullers and what that looks like and what that means. I would think that one sign of success would be an increase in, let's say, the frequency and tempo of these types of operations. And there I'd like to go to one other myth, which is that the government has been remarkably slow in conducting sort of technical disruption operations. Since 2020, there have been 30 publicly acknowledged marketplace or criminal infrastructure or national security nation-state infrastructure disruption operations. That's at a pace of 6 a year or about 1 every 2 months on average. Conducting what is a very technical global operation that requires the input from the private sector, our international partners, on that pace actually has been extremely difficult and consumed a lot of resource and effort. And so I guess I would take exception to say that not enough is being attempted. I also, though, question whether putting more fingers to keyboards will necessarily create a tremendous groundswell in the number of operations. And I say that in part because a lot of the operations that have been conducted are opportunistic. There is this thought that you just have to hack harder. That's how we'll get more of this. We'll just hack harder. And in fact, often there's an element of luck. There's an element of the target making a mistake. There's sometimes an element of us having someone in place who was a human source who could provide us with information that makes this sort of thing possible. And that's not exactly a thing that scales with just adding more people to the mix or adding the private sector to the mix. But one metric would be tempo and the number of operations. I will say that we've done certain things that will make trying to create metrics around this sort of thing more difficult. Things like, and hopefully this actually gets some follow through. We had the Cyber Incident Reporting for Critical Infrastructure Act, which would have created at least some sort of baseline for mandatory reporting for these sort of at least ransomware incidents and other incidents. That was supposed to be finalized per the statute in September. CISA announced that it would be pushing that off until May of 2026. Regardless of whether you have kind of issues with the scope of that particular reporting requirement, I do think that getting that sort of information is almost essential to understanding whether you are making any progress in this area. The reporting in this area is horrendous. We all know that. And so the ability to kind of measure your progress is extremely difficult.
Yeah, Can I just make a point on that? Because I think there's this fallacy that like increasing the tempo means we'll be doing better against the adversary. And like one of the things that came out during my time in the administration was this really great academic article by this guy, Swiss researcher Lennart Maschmeyer, called The Subversive Trilemma, where he did an analysis of Russian cyber operations against Ukraine prior to the most recent conflict. And he talks about like there are three factors that play against each other. You guys are cyber people, so you all know in Silicon Valley, we talk about like good, fast, cheap, pick two. Like you can't actually have all three. For Lennart Maschmeyer's piece, he talks about speed, impact, and control, right? You cannot have all three at once. And when he talks about control, he means things like, does the operation do exactly what you intended to do, or does it spin out of control? And the out of control operation that he talks about like NotPetya, right? Like NotPetya put together relatively quickly, spun out of control, had a rebound effect into Russia. So like if we talk about, hey, we're going to like just really up the tempo on these operations, we are also talking about like either reducing the impact or reducing the control, right? And so like there is this place where if the goal, as Leonard says, is like we are trying to have impact on the problem, then it's really important that we design what the impact is and we think about it, and like we might sacrifice speed to be able to get the impact, because like there are these trade-offs when it comes to the building of cyber operations that, you know, happen for us, and it made us think differently in the department about planning. But it also means that like we need to think differently about the ways in which we are going to respond, because increasing tempo will cause ripple effects in one of the other two things. It'll either be less impactful because you can do a whole bunch of like, you got a bag full of DDoS, you know, attacks, or right, you're doing something that's like super impactful, leaves like, you know, shipping liners sitting dead afloat in the water, but it is spun way out of control. And so like, this is one of those things that I think as we think about private sector offensive cyber, to what end, it's really important to keep those factors in mind, because those are sort of immutable factors of cyber operations that apply not only to adversaries, but also apply to us. Now, there is also a scale issue in here, but I think that like when we talk about like, we're going to increase the tempo, we have to be really careful about what we're asking for.
So to that end, Meredith, can you tell us, I mean, what is the appetite? What have you seen based on your time in the government? And then also, I know it's only been 5 weeks, but even in just your relationship with industry and private sector, what is the appetite for private sector companies to even take that on and to join in these types of missions?
So I'll speak to not just my 5 weeks at Halcyon, but also just engagements with industry from my time at FBI. I think it's varied. And I wouldn't necessarily categorize it into an appetite to be involved in offensive cyber operations versus not. It's an appetite to see, to not sit there defending folks' networks or your own, and you see those opportunistic opportunities, not to use those words strung together, but you see them in real time, sitting there defending someone's network or defending your own. Or there are researchers within companies or white hat researchers who have their own personas in the underground forums, develop their own relationships with ransomware actors, other malicious cyber actors, and they see opportunities in real time because they're having conversations with these guys, or they see something happening on their infrastructure that, oh, well, that's a mistake. And if I could really make them have a bad day. And wouldn't that be just great for everyone? And I think the frustration is a lot of these folks that in industry that we've talked to, they do have the number, if they've been in it a while, to their local cyber squad or to someone at the fort or elsewhere in government to say like, hey, I see something. But to talk about scope and scale, you get what you pay for. And so there isn't necessarily a phone number, a unified phone number or the phone number that you can reliably call and have fast action on what you're seeing. Now, is it that I'm recommending a phone number? Absolutely not. I shudder to think what would happen. But I think we could envision using pre-existing structures, potentially funding them better, training them better, resourcing them better. I mentioned the 55 cyber task forces all over the country attached to the FBI field offices and the very skilled cyber squads sitting there. There's an opportunity for folks to join those cyber task forces. Be you a white hat researcher, a sheriff, a deputy sheriff, a member of, your Secretary of State's office who's attached to the cyber force of the governor's commission, you name it, right? And the will to join, but also what's going on inside of that task force varies. You can't walk into each cyber task force and order a cyber latte and you get the same one brewed for you every time. And I do think and I don't think we will ever get to cyber Starbucks. It's not what I'm recommending either. I do think there's an opportunity with better appropriations and thoughtful frameworks by which you can encourage folks to be routed to places like the cyber task forces, to the appropriate channels, such as the National Cyber Forensics and Training Alliance, and then other bodies that exist as appropriate, and better messaging about how to bring those opportunities to be part of the fight. To quote what we started with in the beginning of punching folks in the face, I think there's just an appetite to help with punching folks in the face when they deserve it. And so we have to facilitate that.
Yeah. And it's interesting what you say about appropriations too, because like having spent most of my career on the Hill, like if you tell members of Congress that there are task forces in all 50 states and then ask them sort of what the resourcing level is for that, are they providing training to those other people, sheriffs, secretaries of state who participate in them? Are they resourced to do that? Like, I think that there's a real opportunity there to take a look at what the appropriation is to those activities and really try and create more space for people to come in, be trained, have the infrastructure they need so that those task forces become more effective and have more people in them to get after the problem set. As somebody who we would have this conversation between DOD and the FBI, I would say, I think the FBI would choke to death on the spare change in the Department of Defense's couch cushions. There is money. I just don't know that it's as well resourced at the FBI as it probably should be.
So I know we're bumping up against time here. So could we display the QR code one more time? So we want to take another poll, and while we wait for those results to come in, thank you, Amy. Can each of you tell us thank you so much. What is the largest myth around offensive cyber operations that you would want to bust here today? I'll start with you, Meredith. Go ahead.
Leonard stole mine. It's the one that no worries. But I think it's just that important that I'm going to repeat it, and it's that we just need to hack more. And I really do think that lying behind this, what we haven't talked about is a deterrence framework, or what are our strategic goals. As much as as I've said, an appetite for being part of the fight or contributing in some ways to resilience, defense, offense, I do think that there has to be a national recognition, at least amongst the cybersecurity community, that everyone's thing that they care about most isn't going to be the one that's most prioritized. However, there's thanks, Nick, looking at you. But I think there should also be space and communication so that folks feel heard and they get whatever their thing is on the board, and they know that maybe, or at least annually, or there's a process in the future where that could be ranked.
When I was in the department, I had a PowerPoint presentation that was about myths, and I had 6 of them that I had to run around to talk to people about how cyber operations work, that they were importing these assumptions based on their experience of warfare in the real world, and thinking that cyber operations work that way, and we'd have to debunk a lot of them. I think top on the list, which keeps coming back up though, is that cyber deterrence is like nuclear deterrence, that there's something that you can do in cyber that, like nuclear weapons, could stop the other side from seeking unauthorized access to your networks. And it is just not feasible. The whole cyber deterrence frame, which came because Cybercom was originally under Stratcom, and the nuclear deterrence thinking infects the whole organization. Then when it came out, it like it brought it with it. But there are so many people who are stuck around this idea that that cyber deterrence is a real thing, and somehow we are failing because we haven't stopped the adversary from getting access to our network. But like, dirty little secret, we are all over theirs too. Like there are certain mission sets for which they are so part of someone's national security priorities that they will continue to do them regardless of what we say, because they have a boss who's told them, go get access to that network, and if you don't, I'm going to fire you. And so like they're going to keep coming. But like cyber deterrence and the mutuality of it, that whole framing is really problematic. It also limits people to thinking like there's something in the cyber domain that you could do to stop things in the cyber domain. And one of the things that we talked about in the Department of Defense is that it's integrated deterrence, that like cyber is not like dueling. It's not like your adversary picked pistols and you are stuck shooting back with a pistol. Like they shot at you at cyber. You don't have to shoot at them at cyber. You could shoot at them with sanctions. You could shoot at them with missiles. Like it's like it depends on what we're doing. And so the idea that you are stuck in domain in this deterrence framework is like one of the most frustrating things that we had to deal with, because like there are certain things in like cyber operations, like the impact that you have are limited by your adversary or victim's upper bound of reliant or upper bounded by their reliance on the system that you are designed to affect. And if they're not that reliant on the system, like, there's not that much you can do, which is why everybody talks about resilience, so that you are less reliant on the systems. But like the whole cyber deterrence framing as if it's nuclear deterrence is like one of the most problematic things that I have seen in people's understanding of cyber. They also do things like think that cyber operations are like really high up on the escalation ladder, like relative to nuclear weapons. And it's like cyber is happening all the time, every day. And like you don't even notice it. It's like not that high on the escalation ladder, but it could be depending on what else you're pairing it with. So like I have a whole like, I won't go through the other 5 bullets, but that's one of them.
Leonard?
It's quick. I think maybe the biggest myth in my mind is that authorizing the private sector to conduct offensive cyber operations will be a needle moving decision. I think the framing of what we need to do, impose costs on our adversaries, I think it's not entirely right. I mean, I think we have to make it more costly for them. And I think among the ways you make it more costly is by frustrating their efforts. And one of the ways you do that is by making yourself more resilient and hardening the target. And I think if you're to invest the effort that I think is required to seriously deal with the issues that we've talked about, and I think they could be dealt with. They take a lot of work. They take a lot of frankly, I think it take legislation of various sorts. You could get there, but I wonder if that investment of time might not be better spent elsewhere.
Thank you for that. Okay, so the results are in, and interestingly, the distribution completely shifted. So first, I'm going to note that 5% who voted for unsanctioned individuals to hack back dropped to 0. But we have completely stuck with military and intelligence agencies garnering the most support. But then also, interestingly, law enforcement and government certified private companies, 64 and 50% respectively, both dropped down to 11%. And then government certified individuals dropped from 32 to 5%. So a little bit of influencing up here by our heavyweights punching back in the face, whatever metaphor we want to use. But it's certainly a very packed debate. And I hope we busted a couple of myths today and can keep the conversation going. Michael, Ari, thanks so much. Thank you, panelists.
Thank you very much. Let's thank the panel.